The U.S. Navy has positioned an aircraft carrier off the coast of Yemen into the Gulf of Aden following recent attacks from the Iran-backed terrorist group, the Houthis. Now, to talk about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from Los Angeles. Lisa, the U.S. Navy has taken this measure against the Houthis, who have allegedly been disrupting international shipping in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf with daily attacks against commercial vessels.
Yes, so this has been ongoing. Just to separate this into a more macro level, the Iran-backed insurgencies in the Middle East, we're talking about Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So I'm separating it from the war against Israel, have hit U.S. assets and European assets more than 90 times in the last 2 months since the Hamas massacre on October 7th. Now, the White House is trying to kind of hope that this goes away on its own, like a pesky mosquito, and not wanting to escalate things, to drag itself into a war, because we all know the head of the dragon is Iran's regime, who is controlling both aspects of the war, the insurgencies against the U.S. and European allies, and also against Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad against Israel. Now, the best way to deter an enemy is to not allow them to begin flexing to begin with, but that's too late for the United States, for the West in general. And now we see the Houthis hitting the U.S. assets. We see Syria, we see Iraq, of course, Hezbollah and Hamas getting involved on the Israel front. So yeah, you're seeing, we're parking our carriers, which is, a good move by the United States in order to show some leadership and deterrence. But will it work this late in the game is the question. Will it actually deter Iran's regime from backing down from this master plan that it has?
Now, the U.S. Central Command says an American warship operating in the Red Sea, Lisa, ended up shooting down around 14 attack drones that were launched from Yemen.
Yeah, now imagine. Now, again, the United States is not committed to firing back against Yemen. So any headline you're seeing is probably, after 10 to 1, meaning it's taken a while for them to even consider this, again, more than just the pesky mosquito that just keeps coming back and buzzing and buzzing and buzzing and trying to provoke an attack by the United States. The Biden administration is in a very, very precarious situation, obviously. The lowest approval ratings of all time. You have wars going on in many different parts, and you have almost wars. You have basically many heated crises going on in different parts of the world. And of course, we're coming up against the 2024 election. So the Biden administration is doing its best to separate itself from any wars, trying to clean its hands of any escalations, particularly in the Middle East, particularly against whether it's involving itself in the war with Israel or getting involved in its own escalations with these insurgencies that are supported by Iran's regime.
And Lisa, the Israel Defense Forces announced the discovery of one of the largest tunnels built by the terrorist group Hamas. The vast subterranean structure was located near the Erez border, crossing located in the northern part of Gaza. It spans well over 4 kilometers, and apparently it was used by Gazans on a daily basis.
Daily basis. Now, this is for all of those who want to talk about blockades. And I was on a show last week, Hal, where the host was trying to convince me of caloric restrictions on Gazans, and it's Israel's fault that the Gazans are hungry. This is the reason the Gazans are hungry, because every penny that Hamas has spent on war, on terrorism, on tunnels, on missiles. It's horrific. If you've seen the footage of this tunnel, 2.5 miles long, it's an actual tunnel. Cars can fit through it. I mean, they've used this obviously for terror purposes, to hide, to transport back and forth, to get into Israel. Of course, we saw that on October 7th. And that is why this ground operation by Israel is so complicated. That's why it's taking so long. And again, remember the human shields. They are in the tunnels, they're in the hospitals, they're in the schools, they're in the mosques. This is all Hamas's fault. And I think it's very frustrating to see world opinion shift because people don't realize or don't want to accept or don't want to hear these realities. When you look at these tunnels and you realize how complex these terror organizations have become, how much money they have had to put into this war, how much money they have had to put into their terror infrastructures, then you understand more why the Palestinian people, just like the Israelis, are victims of Hamas and their leadership that, again, are spending the people's money on terrorism and instead of improving the quality of life over there.
The White House says U.S. President Joe Biden stands by his elusive two-state solution to the Gaza war, Lisa. This despite public disagreements with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Biden is backing control by the Palestinian Authority?
It's actually very tone deaf, Hal, when you think about it. Right now, Israel is fighting an existential threat, meaning Hamas has sworn that it not only should not one Israeli exist, not only should the state of Israel not exist, but they are in their charter are after Jews, to fight and kill Jews, period. Now, isn't it tone deaf for the White House to come along and push a policy of two states living side by side in harmony? That would be wonderful, but it could never happen, as we can see the reality on the ground. You could also look at the different attempts of jihad throughout the world. We're seeing it all over, including in Canada, including in Europe, including in the United States. Hate crimes rising hundreds of percent, escalating and exponentially growing since the war has started. And of course, that just, again, proves that they are not looking to live side by side with Jews or believe in a state of Israel. When they say from the river to the sea, that is not a call for coexistence.
There's a report surfacing by the Washington Free Beacon that the Biden administration has given $34 million to confidential aid groups in Gaza. But military analysts, Lisa, are warning that the money could end up in the hands of Hamas.
Yeah, absolutely. When there's no accountability on, again, taxpayer money that is going to these groups, why are we calling them confidential groups? Why aren't we transparent about where they're going? Why isn't there a vetting system as to where this money is going? If we believe that there's a good chance this will end up in terrorist hands, taxpayers deserve more than that, and to know where their money is going. And of course, when you're looking at the larger scale, when you see the Biden administration and President Biden himself standing at the podium and offering some sort of support for Israel and its right to defend itself, but then giving money to those who are the enemies of Israel and do not want to see Israel's existence any longer. It's kind of a very different picture than the one that the Biden administration is hoping to paint. So a lot of flip-flopping here, a lot of different things, but thank God for these investigative reports that bring out a lot of these realities, and hopefully that the Biden administration will be pushed to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, as journalists, we got to hold the government to account. Now, Lisa, over the weekend, Iran announced that it executed a man convicted of spying for Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. The unnamed man was hanged at the Sahidan Central Prison in the southeastern part of Iran.
So these trumped up charges are very common for Iran's regime. And I think what people don't know is that over the last 2 months, when everyone's attention has been on the Israel-Hamas war, how many innocent individuals have been hanged by Iran's regime, and many of them on these trumped up charges, whether it's spying for the United States, spying for the enemy, enemy of the state, and of course, spying for Israel being a very popular charge. Very, very horrific. Again, this points to U.S. policy. It points to the policy of the West and the world in not holding Iran's regime to account, loosening sanctions that are vital to keeping Iran's regime, limited and freezing their assets, but then, allowing them to go on and to hang and execute innocent people. I mean, their human rights abuses are on the list of many, many, many egregious violations, including, giving money to all these terror organizations, expanding their influence in the region. And of course, going on with their weapons program. If the West truly cared about limiting Iran's regime, it would totally change its policy here on forward.
What's the latest with the $6 billion that was released by the Biden administration and those Iranian assets? And they were talking about potentially refreezing some of those assets. What's the latest there?
Correct. There is legislation to freeze the $6 billion because of what has been obviously brought to light with Iran's regime being responsible for funding, and not only funding, but training Hamas militants to go into Israel on October 7th. Now, this was brought by some Republicans. I know that there are Democrats who believe that Iran's regime should be punished and there should be penalties against them as well. What I always bring to light, Hal, is that we can put aside the $6 billion. What's more egregious is that the Biden administration has removed vital sanctions from Iran's regime that has allowed it to sell oil and bring in its own revenue. So over the last 3 years of the Biden administration, the Iran regime has brought in 60 to $90 billion in oil revenue on its own.
Wow.
So the $6 billion that was given on top of this lopsided prisoner exchange, we already know it was an unfair deal to begin with, but the $6 billion that was given on top really doesn't even come into question, because that check, as many have pointed out, wasn't cashed, it wasn't given to them yet, and now it's in question to freeze that again. But to talk about the larger issue here is that the money should not be frozen. During this war, another $10 billion was given to, I should say, unfrozen by the United States, giving them permission to cash in on that as well. So why are we enriching the regime is the question. Why are we allowing them to move forward, to put more money into global terror and to embolden them more than anything else, to embolden them? If I were sitting in Iran's regime right now, I would think I can play out the clock. While President Biden is in office, there will be no penalties against Iran's regime, and to carry out whatever nefarious agenda that they have left.
You know, we've talked about the rising tensions, obviously in the Middle East, what's happened in Ukraine with the war with Russia. And Lisa, now there's word that a U.S. nuclear-powered sub has arrived in South Korea amid serious concerns that North Korea could launch an international ballistic missile this month.
Right. That is the fear, because North Korea has definitely made it known to the world that it is testing missiles, not so successfully, but nonetheless, the motivation is there. Again, with foreign policy, you want to have a strong stance so that your enemies do not begin flexing to begin with, not to deter once you already believe that that the action is coming. So in this case, again, the United States moving to deter, to kind of prevent anything from escalating, but our enemies are watching very, very closely. Like you said, Hal, if you look around the globe, whether it's Russia, China, Iran's regime, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, any one of them, and you can add North Korea to that list, they know that this is a very weak administration, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. So there's no coincidence here that the bad kids are behaving badly, and they know that they have a certain amount of time while President Biden is still in office.
You know, there's also a growing concern that terrorists are crossing America's southern border and entering the country illegally. But according to a sheriff in Arizona, Mark Lamb, Lisa, the terrorists have already arrived. He says the devil is coming through the back door.
Absolutely. And we've had reports about this at the foreign desk as well. How many thousands, I should say, have been caught at the border who are on the FBI's most wanted list. Now, we're not even talking about the getaways, those who got away, meaning that they have not been cross-referenced with the list or the FBI's most wanted, or they never made it onto the FBI's most wanted. But this goes to the larger point that we want to keep our homeland safe. And when we talk about legal versus illegal immigration, not leaving the border open the way that we have, this is a vulnerability for all of us, including Canada, because we know that they move northward once they get into the country here. Very, very important to pay attention to this, particularly as we know that there is a threat. FBI agents are warning that there has never been a larger threat against the U.S. mainland. They're looking at Hamas or potentially, kind of do-it-yourself lone wolf type terrorists that are emboldened and trained and paid for by Iran's regime. We know that they are not only the #1 state sponsor of terror, but they are also the #1 sponsor of suicide bombers and those who are the lone wolves, right? Very important to not give our enemies a way in. Why are people from places like Iran's regime and Afghanistan and Syria entering from our southern border? It's not just people from impoverished South American countries. So when you look at these facts, you know that there is an issue where there's a vulnerability. And unfortunately, the only people who you hear are either people who left border control because they couldn't take it anymore, or the leadership at the border. So you're looking at states like Arizona and Texas who are leading the charge and letting the Biden administration know that enough is enough.
So, Lisa, before we let you go, and we'll talk to you again in the new year, and I'm hoping you and your family have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. Let's talk about what's happening with former U.S. President Donald Trump and all of his legal troubles. What's the latest there?
My goodness. Well, a lot of his cases have been thrown out, which kind of shows that our legal system is still working. You can't just bring, bogus charges against people, but he still has a ways to go. Whether or not he will be on the ballot, I think, is everyone's question. Here in the United States, we look at, who will be the Democrat nominee? Will it be Joe Biden, or will he step down? Or will it, and will the Republican, coronation go to Donald Trump? So he hasn't been at any of the debates. He's not really, putting out any kind of talking points the way that you're seeing other candidates do so. But if you look at the polls, how on left, right, center, all the polls still indicate that Donald Trump would have a very, very good shot at winning if the elections were held today. So that's pretty significant. Again, we're talking about someone who has not been visible in the sense of running for office. He's been visible in many other ways, but not such great ones too when you look at it. But he has a following. He has support. And I think a lot of people stand by him regardless, and are hoping that they will see him on the ballot.
You know, it's interesting. The polls here in Canada suggest if an election was held here today in Canada, Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada would win in a landslide. But again, those are just polls. We'll have to actually see what happens come election time,
Yeah,
right?
we're seeing a lot of trends moving to conservative candidates. I think a lot of sane people who are, whether in the middle, right, or left of center, are seeing a lot of changes that they see from the left, and are moving more towards conservative candidates. So let's see.
She's the host of The Foreign Desk and our foreign affairs expert. Lisa, thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Happy New Year.